You are not to step foot out of this room until you apologize to your sister. My father screamed that sentence in front of the entire extended family at our annual Christmas dinner. The room was full of whispers, and a few relatives actually chuckled. My face burned with absolute humiliation, but I simply looked at him calmly and said one single word: fine. The next morning, when my father burst through my door to yell at me some more, he found a completely empty room. At that exact moment, our family lawyer rushed through the front door of the estate, trembling and pale, and shouted, "Sir, what on earth have you done?" Before I tell you exactly what happened next, let me know where you are watching this video from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you have ever been pushed into a corner by your own family just to protect a terrible outsider. My name is Sydney. I am 32 years old and I work as a forensic accountant. My entire career is built on digging through complex financial records to expose corporate fraud and hidden assets. I have always prided myself on my sharp logic and rationality, but it seems that rationality never had a place in my own family. We are a prominent African American family in Chicago. My father, Richard, is the chief executive officer of Grayson Logistics, a massive transportation company founded by my late grandfather. My mother, Vanessa, is a high society socialite who spends her days running charity galas and values our family image above absolutely everything else. Growing up, I always tried to do the right thing. I got top grades, worked incredibly hard, and built a completely independent career for myself. Yet in my parents' eyes, I was always just a blur in the background. The family spotlight was permanently fixed on my younger sister, Brianna. At 28 years old, Brianna is a social media influencer. She spends her entire day taking heavily staged photos, shopping with my parents' credit cards, and playing the delicate victim whenever the slightest thing goes wrong. Then Connor entered the picture. Connor is Brianna's white husband who constantly wears the facade of a tech startup entrepreneur. He walked into our family with a subtle sense of entitlement, acting like he was superior to everyone else. Connor was always bragging about his new application's multi-million-dollar funding rounds and walking around in expensive leather loafers that he could not actually afford. My parents absolutely worshipped him because they firmly believed Connor was going to elevate our family into the elite future tech world. Everything exploded on Christmas Eve, just a few months ago. My father hosted an incredibly lavish dinner at the main estate. The dining room was packed with aunts, uncles, and cousins. I sat quietly at the far end of the long table, enjoying my prime rib. Sitting directly across from me were Brianna and Connor. Suddenly, right as everyone was raising their glasses for a toast, Brianna slammed her fork down onto her plate. She covered her face with both hands and began sobbing violently and dramatically. The entire dining room went completely silent instantly. My mother rushed over and wrapped her arms around Brianna's shoulders, frantically asking what was wrong with her precious daughter. Brianna sniffled, reached into her expensive designer handbag, and pulled out a thick stack of printed documents. She slammed the papers down onto the center of the dining table and pointed a trembling finger directly at me. "She ruined us!" Brianna screamed through her theatrical tears. "Sydney ruined Connor's company. We are going to lose absolutely everything because of her jealous and vindictive heart." I sat there completely stunned, put my water glass down, and looked at my sister in total confusion. "What on earth are you talking about, Brianna?" Connor leaned forward, resting both of his elbows on the table. A smug and arrogant smirk formed on his lips. "Do not play the innocent victim with us, Sydney," he said, using that slow, patronizing tone he always reserved exclusively for me. I was exactly one signature away from securing a $5 million investment from a major venture capital firm. But this morning the investors pulled out entirely, and my inside contact told me exactly why. A senior software expert at your firm sent them a fake technical audit, claiming my source code was unstable and full of massive security breaches. I let out an exhausted laugh. "I do not even know what your software does, Connor," I replied, keeping my voice completely steady. "I work in forensic accounting, not software engineering. I do not have the free time to care about your little startup project." "Look at how she talks to my husband," Brianna wailed, burying her face in my mother's shoulder. She hates that I have a happy marriage and that Connor is about to be a millionaire, so she used her financial industry connections to destroy his $5 million contract. These emails are the solid proof that she secretly contacted the investors to slander Connor. I glanced over at the scattered papers on the table. Even upside down, I could easily tell those documents were incredibly sloppy forgeries. The email formatting was completely wrong, and the financial projections made absolutely zero logical sense. Anyone with basic business knowledge would instantly see it was a fabricated lie. But my family did not care about the truth or logical evidence. They only cared about protecting the perfect narrative Brianna had created. My father Richard stood up aggressively at the head of the table. His face was burning red with intense anger. He did not ask me a single question about the truth. He just stared at me with eyes full of absolute disgust and disappointment. "How could you do something so wicked to your own blood?" my father shouted, his voice booming so loudly it silenced all the whispers of our relatives. "Your sister brings joy and pride to this house. Her husband is working hard to build an empire. And you just sit in the shadows trying to drag them down because you are so pathetic and lonely." "Dad, those documents are completely fake," I tried to explain, keeping my posture firm. "If you would just take one single minute to look closely at the financial details." "Shut your mouth," my father roared, slamming his fist down onto the table so hard the crystal glasses violently shook. The entire extended family stared at me. A few older cousins shook their heads in disapproval. I was a 32-year-old woman with a highly successful career out in the real world. Yet inside this room, I was nothing but a punching bag for them to release their frustrations on. My father pointed his index finger straight toward the grand staircase in the foyer. "You are not to step foot out of this room until you are ready to apologize to your sister and fix the massive damage you caused Connor. You are grounded. Go to your room right this instant and think deeply about the incredible shame you have brought upon this family today." Grounded? He was literally grounding a fully grown, independent woman. My face burned hot with intense humiliation. I looked over at my mother, who was glaring at me with cold, empty eyes. I looked at Brianna, who was poorly hiding a victorious smile behind her napkin. And I looked directly at Connor, who gave me a condescending little wink. I stood up slowly from my chair. I did not scream. I did not shed a single tear. I looked straight into my father's furious eyes and said exactly one word: "Fine." As I walked step by step up the grand staircase, I could hear them down below comforting and praising Connor. They honestly thought they had won. They thought they had finally put me back into my lowly place. But they had absolutely no idea that sending me up to that room was the worst mistake they had ever made in their entire lives. I was not going upstairs to cry into my pillow. I was going upstairs to prepare the total destruction of their comfortable and fake lives forever. The heavy oak door of my childhood bedroom clicked shut behind me. I did not throw myself onto the bed to weep like my mother probably expected. Instead, I walked straight to my closet and pulled out my overnight bag. The room was exactly as Elaine had designed it. Pale blue walls, heavy curtains, and an overwhelming sense of suffocation. But tonight it was just a staging area for my departure. I opened my laptop and inserted a small encrypted USB drive. The screen illuminated my face as lines of data began transferring. While they were downstairs eating pie and celebrating my humiliation, I was downloading the complete financial history of Grayson Logistics. As a forensic accountant, I had access to everything. I had spent the last 3 months quietly tracking the bizarre discrepancies in the company accounts. Connor thought he was a genius, but he left a digital trail so wide a child could follow it. He had been using the family business name to set up shell companies, washing money to cover his massive gambling debts. I watched the progress bar inch closer to 100%. My mind drifted back to my grandfather, the man who actually built the empire. My father was currently running into the ground. Grandpa Harrison was the only person in this family who saw me for who I really was. He knew Richard was blinded by ego. He knew Elaine was obsessed with appearances, and he certainly saw right through Brianna and her empty charm. Right before he passed away, he handed me an antique brass key. He told me to keep it safe and never mention it until the time was right. The transfer completed with a soft chime. I pulled the USB drive out and slipped it into my coat pocket. I packed only the essentials, leaving behind all the expensive dresses and jewelry my parents had bought me over the years to use as leverage. I placed the antique brass key squarely in the center of the perfectly made bed. It was the key to a safety deposit box that held the original documents of Grandpa Harrison's secret trust, a trust that no one else in the family knew existed. I slipped out the back staircase, the one the catering staff used, and walked out into the crisp winter night. The cold air hit my face, but for the first time in years, I felt entirely free. I got into my car and drove away from the sprawling estate without looking back in the rearview mirror. The next morning, the house was probably thick with tension. I can only imagine the scene based on what I learned later. Richard sat at the head of the breakfast table, sipping his expensive dark roast coffee, waiting for me to come down and beg for forgiveness. Brianna was likely scrolling through her phone, acting like the fragile victim, while Connor buttered his toast with that smug sense of victory. When 9 o'clock rolled around and I had not made an appearance, my father's patience snapped. He slammed his coffee cup down and marched up the grand staircase. He was ready to deliver another booming lecture about respect and family duty. He threw open the door to my bedroom, expecting to find me crying in the corner. Instead, he found total silence. The bed was perfectly made. The closet doors were wide open, showing empty hangers. The only thing left in the room was that heavy brass key resting on the pristine duvet. Richard stared at the empty room, his face turning purple with rage. He stormed back downstairs, holding the key in his closed fist. "She left," he roared, pacing the length of the formal dining room. "That ungrateful, arrogant girl actually left the house. She thinks she can just walk away from her punishment without apologizing to you, Brianna." Elaine gasped, pressing a hand to her chest. "How dramatic," she sneered. "Let her go. She will be back by dinner when she realizes she has nowhere else to stay." Connor leaned back in his chair, his eyes gleaming with malice. "You should cut off her credit cards, Richard. That will teach her a lesson in humility. She cannot survive without the family money." My father pointed a finger at Connor, nodding in agreement. "You are absolutely right, son. I am going to freeze every single account attached to her name. Let us see how long she lasts out there without my financial support." He pulled out his phone and angrily dialed the private number for the family banker. But before the call could even connect, the heavy mahogany front doors of the estate burst open. Standing in the foyer was Mr. Caldwell, our longtime family attorney. Caldwell was a man who usually maintained perfect composure. He was the epitome of professionalism. But this morning his face was completely pale, and his hands were physically shaking as he clutched a thick leather binder to his chest. "Richard," my father barked, lowering his phone. "What is the meaning of this, Caldwell? Why are you barging into my home unannounced on the morning after Christmas?" Caldwell took a deep, trembling breath and walked into the dining room. He looked around at the luxurious spread of food, at Elaine in her silk robe, at Brianna and Connor sitting there like royalty. Then he looked directly at my father. His voice cracked as he spoke. "Richard, what on earth have you done?" Caldwell asked, his tone a mixture of terror and disbelief. "Where is Charmaine?" "She threw a childish tantrum and left." My father scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. "I grounded her last night for sabotaging Connor's business and demanding she apologize. She decided to run away instead. I was just about to call the bank to freeze her accounts. She will come crawling back soon enough." Caldwell dropped the heavy leather binder onto the dining table. The thud echoed through the silent room. "You grounded her," the lawyer repeated, his voice rising to a frantic pitch. "You grounded a 35-year-old woman and drove her out of this house." "So what?" my father yelled back, his ego bruising. "I am the head of this family. I make the rules under this roof." Caldwell let out a sound that was half sob, half manic laugh. "You fool," he whispered, pulling a document from the binder. "You absolute fool. You do not own this roof, Richard. You never did." The entire room froze. Connor slowly lowered his coffee cup. Brianna stopped scrolling on her phone. Elaine stared at the lawyer as if he had lost his mind. "What are you talking about?" my father demanded, stepping forward. "I am the chief executive officer of Grayson Logistics. My father left this estate and 51% of the company to me when he died." Caldwell shook his head violently. "No, Richard, he did not. Harrison set up a blind trust before his passing. You were never the primary beneficiary, you were simply a placeholder. The true owner of the Grayson estate, the controlling shareholder of the company, and the sole heir to the legacy has always been Charmaine." Elaine let out a sharp gasp. "That is impossible," she screeched. "Charmaine is unstable. Harrison would never leave the empire to her over his own son." "It is the truth," Caldwell said, flipping to a page marked with a red tab. "And Harrison included a very specific clause in the trust. It was called the Respect Clause. It stated that if you ever attempted to strip Charmaine of her dignity, forced her out of her home, or maliciously punished her, the trust would automatically execute a full transfer of all assets into her name instantly. By publicly humiliating her last night and driving her out, you triggered the clause, Richard." Just then, my father's cell phone began to ring. He looked down at the screen. It was the president of their bank. He answered it on speakerphone, his hands trembling slightly. Richard, the banker's voice filled the silent room. "I am calling to inform you that we have received a federal directive. All of your personal and corporate accounts have been frozen effective immediately. You no longer have authorization to access Grayson Logistics funds." My father dropped the phone. It hit the hardwood floor with a sharp crack. His knees buckled, and he collapsed into the dining chair, staring blankly at the antique key he was still holding in his hand. The heavy mahogany door of my bedroom clicked shut, locking out the noise of the Christmas dinner below. I did not throw myself onto the mattress to weep. I did not stare into the mirror and wonder why my family hated me. Those days were long gone. I walked straight to the closet and pulled out my black leather travel bag. My movements were precise and calculated. I folded my clothes flat, leaving behind every expensive dress and piece of jewelry Vanessa and Richard had ever bought me. I only packed the items I had purchased with my own hard-earned money. The walls of this room were a pale, suffocating pink that Vanessa had chosen years ago to make me look softer and more compliant. It never worked. I walked over to the vintage oak desk by the window and opened my laptop. The screen glowed in the dark room, illuminating my face. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small black USB drive. I plugged it into the port and watched the security verification pop up on the screen. I typed in my administrative password. As a forensic accountant, I had backdoor access to every single server at Grayson Logistics. Richard thought he was running a tight ship, but his corporate network security was an absolute joke. I navigated through the hidden encrypted folders I had been secretly compiling for the past 3 months. Connor had stood in that dining room and accused me of sending a fake technical audit to ruin his $5 million venture capital funding. The truth was, there never was any venture capital funding. It was a massive lie he fabricated to cover his tracks and play the victim. Connor thought he was a criminal mastermind, but he left a digital footprint so incredibly massive it was almost insulting to my profession. I clicked on the master folder labeled Offshore Transfers and initiated the download to my encrypted drive. Line by line, the data transferred onto the small device. The spreadsheets detailed exactly how Connor had been using Grayson Logistics as a shell company to funnel corporate money into an illegal sports gambling syndicate. He was drowning in $2 million of debt to dangerous people. He was secretly using my grandfather's legacy to pay it off month by month. My father was so busy admiring Connor's fake designer shoes and listening to his empty tech jargon that he never noticed the company accounts bleeding dry. The progress bar slowly filled on my screen. 90%, 95%, 100%. Download complete. I safely ejected the drive and slipped it into the inner pocket of my jacket. That small piece of plastic held the absolute power to send Connor to federal prison and strip my father of his precious executive title. There was one last thing to do. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small velvet pouch. Inside was a heavy antique brass key. It was cold to the touch. My grandfather Harrison gave this key to me on his deathbed. He knew my father was blinded by arrogance, and that my mother only cared about country club aesthetics. He knew Brianna would eventually marry a parasite like Connor. My grandfather told me to keep this key hidden until the day they pushed me too far. That day had finally arrived. The key belonged to a private vault downtown. Inside that vault were the original legal documents for his secret blind trust. I walked over to the large canopy bed. I smoothed out the expensive silk duvet, making sure there were absolutely no wrinkles. Then I placed the antique brass key directly in the center of the mattress. It sat there gleaming under the dim moonlight shining through the window. It was a silent message, a warning they would not understand until it was too late. I slung my bag over my shoulder and slipped out through the side door that led to the staff staircase. The house was massive, and everyone was still in the dining room, drinking expensive wine and laughing at my expense. The cold winter air hit my face as I walked out to my car. I started the engine and drove away from the Grayson estate in total silence. I did not look back. The sun rose the next morning, casting a bright light over the snow-covered grounds of the estate. Downstairs in the grand kitchen, my family was continuing their fake charade. My father Richard sat at the head of the breakfast table, drinking his imported dark roast coffee. He felt incredibly powerful this morning. He truly believed he had finally broken my spirit and put me in my lowly place. Vanessa was flipping through a luxury lifestyle magazine, planning her next expensive charity gala outfit. She cared more about what her wealthy friends thought than the fact that she had just allowed her eldest daughter to be publicly humiliated. Brianna was holding her phone up to the window, recording a video for her followers. She was using a soft, sad voice, pretending to be exhausted from hosting such a perfect and demanding family holiday. Connor was aggressively cutting his eggs with that same smug sense of superiority, thinking his elaborate lie had worked flawlessly and that the family fortune was his for the taking. When the clock finally struck 9, my father wiped his mouth with a linen napkin. He announced to the table that it was time for me to come down and deliver my formal apology to Connor and Brianna. He expected me to stand before them with my head bowed, begging for forgiveness and financial support. He marched up the grand staircase, his leather slippers slapping heavily against the polished wood steps. He was rehearsing the harsh words he was going to use to break me down even further. He walked down the long hallway and stopped directly in front of my door. He did not knock. He aggressively turned the handle and pushed the door wide open, ready to yell his morning demands. "Sydney, get down to the dining room right now," he barked, his voice booming into the room. But nobody answered. The room was completely silent. The air was cold and still. My father stepped inside, his angry expression slowly turning into deep confusion. The closet doors were wide open, revealing empty wooden hangers. My personal toiletries were missing from the bathroom counter. The room felt completely hollow. Then his eyes landed on the bed. It was perfectly made without a single crease in the fabric, and resting right in the middle of the silk duvet was the heavy antique brass key. Richard walked over slowly, staring at it. He had never seen the key before, but he recognized the old Grayson family crest engraved on the handle. His face turned red with fresh anger, realizing I had simply walked out without asking for his permission. He grabbed the key tightly in his fist, his knuckles turning white. He stormed out of the room, completely unaware that the countdown to his total destruction had just begun. Richard marched down the grand staircase, his heavy footsteps echoing through the massive foyer. His face was a mask of pure rage. He clutched the antique brass key so tightly the cold metal dug deep into his palm. He burst through the double doors of the formal dining room where the rest of the family was still enjoying their lavish holiday breakfast. The smell of expensive bacon and freshly brewed espresso filled the air. Vanessa looked up from her luxury lifestyle magazine, visibly annoyed by the sudden loud disruption. Brianna paused her video recording, letting out a dramatic sigh of frustration. Connor just smirked, taking another slow, deliberate bite of his eggs. Where is she? Vanessa asked, her tone dripping with irritation and disdain. Is she finally ready to apologize for ruining my peaceful morning? She is gone, Richard bellowed, slamming the heavy brass key onto the polished mahogany dining table. The loud crack made everyone jump. The girl actually packed her bags and left in the middle of the night like a coward. She left this old key on her bed like some kind of insolent joke just to mock me. Brianna gasped loudly, covering her mouth with her perfectly manicured hand. Oh my God, she actually ran away. She is so completely selfish and toxic. She cannot even take responsibility for trying to destroy Connor's life and ruin our family reputation. Connor leaned back in his expensive leather chair, crossing his arms over his chest. He wore a look of absolute triumph and superiority. Well, Richard, I hate to say it, but maybe this is actually for the best. Sydney has always been a dark cloud over this family. But you know she will not last a single week out there on her own. She is probably checking into some cheap motel right now, using your credit cards to pay for it while playing the victim. Vanessa nodded in total agreement, taking a slow sip of her morning mimosa. Connor is exactly right, darling. You need to cut off her funds immediately. She thinks she is so independent and smart. So let her see what the real world actually costs without the Grayson family name and our wealth to protect her. Richard's chest puffed out with arrogant pride. He fully believed he held all the power in the universe. You are absolutely right, Vanessa. I am going to freeze every single card in her wallet right now. I will drain her personal checking accounts and completely block her access to all corporate expense accounts. If she wants to walk out of my house without my permission, then she leaves with absolutely nothing but the clothes on her back. He pulled his sleek smartphone from his pocket and aggressively dialed the private direct number for the president of their primary bank. The phone began to ring. Richard smiled over at Connor, sharing a moment of toxic masculine solidarity. They truly thought they were teaching me a harsh lesson. They thought I was going to come crawling back to the estate on my hands and knees, begging for their financial support and their forgiveness. But before the bank president could even answer the call, a massive crash echoed from the front of the house. The heavy oak double doors of the Grayson mansion were thrown wide open, hitting the interior walls with a violent, echoing thud. Richard lowered his phone slowly, frowning deeply. Who on earth would dare enter his private estate like that? Frantic footsteps scrambled across the polished marble floor of the foyer. A man stumbled into the dining room, breathing heavily and sweating profusely. It was Mr. Caldwell, our longtime family lawyer. Caldwell was an older man who usually moved with slow, deliberate grace. He always wore impeccably tailored suits and maintained an aura of absolute total control in every situation. But this morning, Caldwell looked like he had just seen a terrifying ghost. His expensive suit jacket was unbuttoned, his silk tie was yanked loose around his neck, and his face was the pale color of dirty snow. He was physically trembling from head to toe, clutching a thick, heavy leather briefcase tightly to his chest, like a protective shield. Richard stared at the lawyer in utter bewilderment. Caldwell, what in the world is the meaning of this? Why are you barging into my home like a madman on the day after Christmas? Caldwell did not immediately answer him. His wild, terrified eyes darted frantically around the room, scanning the faces sitting at the table. He looked at Vanessa sitting calmly in her silk robe. He looked at Brianna, who was staring at him with wide, confused eyes. He looked at Connor, who suddenly seemed very nervous and shifted in his seat. Finally, Caldwell's desperate eyes locked directly onto Richard. Where is Sydney? Caldwell choked out, his voice cracking with pure, unadulterated panic. Richard, tell me exactly where Sydney is right this very second. Richard scoffed loudly, waving his hand dismissively at the older man. He completely misread the lawyer's sheer panic, assuming Caldwell was just acting overly dramatic about standard family drama. Relax, Caldwell. You are making a ridiculous scene over nothing. Sydney threw a childish tantrum last night. She tried to ruin Connor's new business venture out of pure petty jealousy. So I grounded her. I told her she was not allowed to leave her room until she gave her sister a proper formal apology. Caldwell's knees literally buckled beneath him. He had to grab the back of an empty wooden chair just to keep himself from collapsing onto the floor. "You grounded her," Caldwell whispered, staring at Richard with absolute horror. "You grounded a 32-year-old independent woman inside this house." "Yes, I did," Richard barked, his fragile ego flaring up instantly. "I am the head of this family and I demand total respect under my roof." But the ungrateful brat decided to pack her bags and sneak out in the middle of the night instead. "She left this stupid key on her bed." Richard pointed angrily at the antique brass key resting innocently on the dining table. Caldwell's eyes widened to the size of dinner plates when he saw the old key. A strange, agonizing sound escaped his throat. It was half sob and half terrified scream. And right now, Richard continued entirely oblivious to the lawyer's total mental meltdown. "I am calling the bank to freeze every single one of her accounts. I am cutting her off entirely. Let us see how long she survives without my money." Caldwell dropped his heavy leather briefcase. It hit the hardwood floor with a deafening slam, bursting wide open and spilling thick legal documents everywhere. "You fool!" Caldwell screamed, his voice echoing fiercely through the massive house. "You absolute ignorant fool! You do not cut Sydney off. You do not own that money. You do not even own this house." The entire dining room fell into a dead, shocked silence. Connor slowly lowered his silver fork. Vanessa's crystal mimosa glass trembled uncontrollably in her hand. Richard stood up, his face turning a dark, angry shade of purple. "Watch your tone with me, Caldwell," Richard threatened aggressively, stepping toward the lawyer. "I am the chief executive officer of Grayson Logistics. My father left this entire estate and the majority controlling shares of the company directly to me. I pay your retainer. You work for me." Caldwell laughed loudly. It was a hysterical, manic laugh that sent cold chills down everyone's spine. "I do not work for you, Richard. I never worked for you. I worked for Harrison Grayson. And after he died, I have been working exclusively for the true heir of this entire empire." Richard stopped dead in his tracks. "What are you talking about? I am the sole heir." Caldwell shook his head violently, tears of pure panic welling in his red eyes. "No, Richard. You were never the heir. You were just a temporary placeholder until Sydney was ready. And by forcing her out of this house last night, you just destroyed your own life." Caldwell stepped forward and slammed the heavy leather-bound file down onto the center of the mahogany dining table. The loud smack made Vanessa jump in her seat, spilling the rest of her mimosa all over her expensive silk robe. Richard stared at the file as if it were a venomous snake. "What is this absolute nonsense, Caldwell?" he demanded, his voice trembling slightly beneath his forced arrogance. "My father left everything to me. I have the original will. I saw him sign it with my own 2 eyes." Caldwell let out a deep, exhausted sigh and wiped the cold sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief. "What you saw your father sign, Richard, was a decoy. It was a surface-level document designed to keep your fragile ego intact, while the real legal maneuvers were handled in absolute secrecy." Harrison Grayson was a brilliant man. He built this entire transportation empire from the ground up, and he was not about to let his arrogant son run it straight into the ground. The lawyer flipped the thick leather cover open, revealing stacks of documents heavily stamped with federal seals and notarized signatures. Months before his death, Harrison established an irrevocable blind trust, Caldwell explained, pointing a trembling finger at the top page. He placed the deed to this exact estate, the massive family investment portfolios, and the 51% controlling stake of Grayson Logistics completely inside that trust. Legally speaking, Richard, you do not own a single brick of this mansion. You do not own a single share of the company. You are merely appointed as an interim manager, a temporary placeholder, meant to keep the executive seat warm. Connor leaned forward, his face completely drained of color. The smug, superior smirk was entirely wiped from his mouth. "Wait a minute." Connor interrupted, his voice losing all its previous confidence. "If Richard does not own the controlling shares, then who does? Who is the primary beneficiary of the blind trust?" Caldwell looked at Connor with a mixture of pity and absolute disgust. The primary beneficiary is the only person in this family who actually inherited Harrison's intelligence and moral compass. The sole heir to the entire Grayson empire has always been Sydney. The dining room erupted into total chaos. Brianna let out a loud, dramatic gasp. "No!" she shrieked, slamming her perfectly manicured hands onto the table. "That is a complete lie. Grandpa loved me. I was always the favorite grandchild. Sydney is a cold, manipulative psycho. Grandpa would never give everything to her and leave us with nothing. Your grandfather saw right through your fake tears," Brianna Caldwell snapped, shutting her down instantly. His voice was cold and firm. "Harrison knew exactly what kind of people you all were. He knew Richard cared more about his country club status than the actual corporate ledger. He knew Vanessa only valued the family name when it bought her expensive dresses and front row seats at charity events. And he knew Sydney was the only one capable of protecting the Grayson legacy from greedy leeches like your husband Connor." Vanessa clutched her pearl necklace, her chest heaving with panicked breaths. "This is illegal," she stammered, her eyes wide with disbelief. "You cannot secretly give away an entire estate. We will take this to court. We will sue you and Sydney for every penny you have. We will claim Harrison was not in his right mind when he signed those papers." "You can certainly try," Vanessa Caldwell replied calmly, adjusting his glasses. But Harrison had himself evaluated by 3 independent psychiatrists the week he signed the trust. He also had the entire signing process recorded on video, with 2 federal judges serving as witnesses. The trust is completely ironclad. It is bulletproof. There is absolutely no legal loophole for you to exploit. Richard snatched the heavy stack of documents from the open folder. His eyes darted wildly across the dense legal jargon, reading the specific clauses, the signatures, and the irrefutable proof of his own total insignificance. His hands began to shake violently, making the thick papers rattle. The documents crumpled under his tightening grip. "This cannot be real," he muttered over and over again, his voice shrinking into a pathetic, hollow whisper. "I am the chief executive officer. I am the patriarch of this family. I built my life around this company." "You were allowed to play the role of the chief executive officer," Richard Caldwell corrected him softly but firmly. "You were allowed to play boss and live in this mansion only as long as you adhered to the strict conditions Harrison laid out in the trust. He knew your temper and he knew how unfairly you treated Sydney, so he put guardrails in place to protect her from you." Connor stood up from his chair, nervously pacing back and forth across the dining room floor. His entire fake millionaire persona was crumbling right before their eyes. "What kind of guardrails?" Connor demanded, his voice cracking with rising panic. "What exactly does this mean for the company funding?" Caldwell ignored Connor and kept his eyes locked on my father. "Harrison trusted Sydney to take over when the time was right. But he also wanted to give you a fair chance, Richard. He allowed you to act as the head of the family under the condition that you never abused your power over the true heir. But you could not even do that. You let your ego blind you. You chose to believe a ridiculous, fabricated lie from an outsider over the word of your own flesh and blood." Richard stared blankly at the crumpled legal papers in his hands. The reality of the situation was finally crashing down heavily upon his shoulders. The entire empire he loved bragging about to his wealthy friends, the private jets, the corporate credit cards, the massive estate, they were all just illusions. He was nothing but a glorified tenant living in his daughter's house and managing his daughter's money. The silence in the room was deafening. The only sound was the heavy, panicked breathing of the people who suddenly realized they were entirely broke. Vanessa slumped back in her chair, looking around the luxurious dining room as if the walls were closing in on her. Every crystal chandelier, every piece of expensive art, every custom piece of furniture legally belonged to the daughter she had neglected and insulted for over 3 decades. Brianna started to cry again, but this time there were no cameras rolling, and there was no fake performance. These were real tears of absolute terror. Her lavish influencer lifestyle, funded entirely by my father, was officially over. She looked at Connor, desperately hoping her husband would use his supposed business brilliance to save them. But Connor was standing frozen, staring at the floor like a trapped rat. His tech startup lie was useless now that the Grayson family bank accounts were no longer under Richard's control. "So what happens now?" Richard asked, his voice completely devoid of its usual booming authority. He looked like a deflated balloon, a pathetic shadow of the man who had yelled at me just 12 hours earlier. Caldwell slowly closed the empty leather binder. "What happens now is entirely up to Sydney," he stated plainly. "She is the sole legal owner of Grayson Logistics and this estate. The blind trust is no longer blind. You have no authority to freeze her accounts, Richard, because those accounts actually belong to her. In fact, the bank has already recognized her as the primary account holder. That is why your access was revoked this morning." Richard buried his face in his trembling hands. The gravity of his massive mistake was finally fully understood. He had grounded the owner of the house. He had banished the billionaire. Caldwell reached into his leather briefcase one more time and pulled out a single sheet of heavy, ivory parchment paper. "This is the exact wording of the respect clause," he said, his voice steady and completely devoid of any sympathy. "Harrison anticipated that your massive ego would eventually override your common sense, Richard. He knew you would try to push Sydney out the moment she stopped blindly obeying you. The clause clearly states that should Richard Grayson ever attempt to evict, disinherit, or publicly degrade Sydney Grayson, the interim management period will instantly and permanently terminate. All corporate and personal assets held within the blind trust will immediately bypass the probation period and vest fully in Sydney's name." Richard stared at this parchment paper as Caldwell placed it directly in front of him. His eyes traced the ink signature of his late father. The writing was black and absolute. There was no ambiguity and no legal gray area. "You triggered this death clause the moment you ordered her to be confined to her room, like a disobedient child." Caldwell continued, looking down at my father with utter disgust. "You humiliated her in front of the entire extended family. You demanded she apologize to a manipulative man who is actively draining this company dry. And when she chose to leave with her dignity intact, you foolishly attempted to financially ruin her. The trust constantly monitors these aggressive actions. The exact moment you placed that phone call to the bank, attempting to freeze her credit cards, the legal tripwire was permanently crossed." Vanessa let out a loud, dramatic wail and buried her face in her trembling hands. Her perfectly styled hair fell out of place, ruining her pristine morning look. All of her extravagant charity gala plans, her exclusive country club memberships, her luxury vacations to Europe, they were all gone in a matter of seconds. "How could Harrison do this to us?" she sobbed loudly, the tears ruining her expensive makeup. "We are his family. We gave him beautiful grandchildren. He did it to protect the only family member who actually cared about the logistics company rather than the money it produced," Caldwell replied coldly, not offering her a single shred of comfort. Connor suddenly lunged forward, his face twisted in a desperate, sweaty panic. "What about my funding?" he yelled, slamming his fist on the table. "What about the seed money Richard promised me for my software launch? You cannot just cut me off, Caldwell. I have serious financial obligations. I have massive debts that need to be paid this week." Before Caldwell could even answer, a sharp ringing sound pierced the tense air of the dining room. It was Richard's cell phone. Richard looked down at the glowing screen. It was a direct priority number from the vice president of the Executive Wealth Management Division at their primary bank. Richard reached out with a trembling hand and tapped the screen to answer, placing it on speakerphone so everyone in the room could hear the final nail in their coffin. His voice was nothing but a raspy, hollow whisper when he spoke. "Hello, Mr. Grayson." The banker's voice came through the speaker, sounding extremely rigid, formal, and completely unsympathetic. "I am calling to officially notify you that our legal department has received the execution orders from the Harrison Grayson Trust. Per the strict legal directives, we have completely frozen all of your personal checking and savings accounts. Your corporate expense accounts and company credit lines have been permanently closed." Richard closed his eyes, a single tear of pure agonizing defeat rolling down his cheek. I understand, he whispered, his spirit totally broken. But the banker was not finished. Furthermore, Mr. Grayson, we have also frozen all accounts belonging to your son-in-law Connor. Since his initial seed funding was directly tied to the Grayson Logistics corporate accounts, and those specific funds are now under federal review for unauthorized offshore transfers, his banking access has been completely revoked. Any lines of credit extended to him under the Grayson family name are null and void, effective immediately. Connor let out a loud, terrifying gasp, as if all the oxygen had just been violently sucked out of the room. No, he shouted, leaning aggressively over the table toward the phone. You cannot do that. You cannot freeze my accounts. I have autopay set up for my luxury car. I have rent due on my office space. I owe people money, very dangerous people. I am sorry, sir. The banker replied, his tone completely indifferent to Connor's rising panic. We are only following the strict legal directives of the new primary account holder. All future financial inquiries regarding Grayson Logistics funds must now be directed exclusively to Sydney. Good day to you all. The line went dead with a soft, brutal click. Connor grabbed his own hair in sheer panic. His carefully crafted wealthy tech bro image completely shattered into a million pieces. The $2 million he owed to the underground sports gambling syndicate was due at the end of the month. He had planned to quietly siphon that exact amount from the company accounts, using his fake venture capital story as a brilliant cover. Now he had absolutely zero access to the money. The dangerous people he owed did not care about blind trusts or silly family drama. They only cared about getting paid in cash. Brianna stood up, her wooden chair scraping loudly and harshly against the hardwood floor. She looked at Connor with wide, terrified, and confused eyes. Connor, what does the bank mean by unauthorized offshore transfers? She asked, her voice trembling with fear. What did you do with the company money? Connor backed away from the dining table, his wild eyes darting toward the front door of the mansion. Shut up, Brianna! He snapped, his voice vicious, cruel, and completely devoid of any love. Just shut your stupid, ignorant mouth. I do not have time to deal with your pathetic crying right now. I need to make a phone call to save my own life. He turned around and literally sprinted out of the dining room, leaving his shocked wife standing there in a puddle of tears. The golden child was finally seeing the real monster she had blindly married. There was no loving husband trying to build a massive tech empire for her future. There was only a desperate criminal who had just lost his golden goose and was about to face the wrath of the criminal underworld. Caldwell began gathering his scattered legal documents, returning them methodically to his leather briefcase. He did not show a single ounce of pity for the greedy people sitting in that room. My work here is done, Caldwell said, securing the brass clasps of his bag. Sydney has officially assumed the role of Chief Executive Officer. She has already hired an independent forensic auditing firm to review every single financial transaction approved by you, Richard, over the last 3 years. If they find any financial discrepancies, you will be held personally liable for the damages. Richard did not move a single muscle. He sat completely frozen in his chair, staring blankly at the cold, expensive breakfast sitting untouched in front of him. He had spent his entire life building a kingdom of arrogance and entitlement. He had allowed his wife to neglect their eldest daughter. He had allowed his youngest daughter to act like a spoiled tyrant. He had welcomed a con artist into their home simply because the man knew how to flatter his massive, fragile ego. And now the daughter he had banished to her room. The daughter he had told to find another place to live was the undisputed queen of the entire empire. Caldwell turned and walked out of the dining room, his steady footsteps echoing loudly in the silent foyer. The heavy mahogany front doors opened and closed, leaving the Grayson family entirely alone in the cold, dark reality of their new absolute poverty. Richard sat in the deafening silence of the dining room for a full 5 minutes before his survival instincts finally kicked in. He stood up so violently, his heavy wooden chair tipped backward and crashed onto the floor. This is a mistake, he muttered, pacing the room like a caged animal. Caldwell is a senile old fool making a power grab. My father would never do this to me. Get dressed, everyone. We are going downtown right now. I am still the chief executive officer of Grayson Logistics, and I am going to march into my office and fix this massive misunderstanding. Connor was already sprinting toward the garage, desperately needing to secure whatever cash he could find before the federal freeze fully locked down the offshore accounts. Vanessa pulled her silk robe tighter around her body, her hands trembling so badly she could barely hold her phone. Brianna just stood there looking completely lost, her perfect morning entirely shattered. Within 10 minutes, they were all piled into Richard's luxury SUV. The drive to the downtown Chicago corporate headquarters was filled with a thick, suffocating tension. Richard gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned completely white. Connor sat in the passenger seat, frantically biting his fingernails and checking his phone every 2 seconds. He was terrified the dangerous men he owed money to were already tracking his location. Vanessa and Brianna sat in the back, completely silent, staring out the tinted windows as their perfect, wealthy reality rapidly dissolved around them. The massive glass and steel skyscraper of Grayson Logistics loomed over the city skyline. Richard parked aggressively in the underground VIP parking structure, ignoring the fact that his reserved spot now had a bright orange traffic cone placed directly in the center of it. He ran over the cone, crushing it under his heavy tires. He marched toward the private executive elevator lobby with his head held high, forcing his chest out to project the same arrogant authority he had worn for the past 10 years. Connor, Vanessa, and Brianna trailed closely behind him, desperately hoping Richard's blind confidence meant everything would somehow be magically fixed. They reached the sleek silver doors of the private elevator. Richard pulled his black corporate access card from his expensive leather wallet and swiped it firmly against the security scanner. Instead of the pleasant green light and soft chime he was used to hearing, the scanner flashed a harsh, solid red. A loud, mechanical buzzing sound echoed through the lobby, indicating access denied. Richard frowned deeply and swiped the card again. Red light. Access denied. He swiped it a third time, much harder, aggressively hitting the plastic against the sensor. Red light. Is the machine broken? Vanessa asked, her voice trembling with rising panic as a few employees walking past turned to look at them. Before Richard could answer, the head of building security walked over. His name was Marcus, and for years he had greeted Richard with a respectful bow and a warm smile. Today, Marcus stood tall, his expression completely neutral and strictly professional. "I am sorry, Mr. Grayson," Marcus said, his voice loud enough for the passing junior executives to hear. "Your executive access card has been deactivated. In fact, all 4 of your family cards have been flagged in the main system. You are no longer authorized to use the private elevator or access the restricted executive floors without a temporary guest pass." Richard stared at the security guard, his face turning a dark, violent shade of purple. "Do you know exactly who I am, Marcus?" he spat out, pointing a trembling finger at the guard's chest. "I pay your salary. I am the head of this entire company. You will override this machine right now and let me up to my office, or I will have you fired and blacklisted from every security firm in this city." Marcus did not flinch or back down. He simply crossed his arms over his chest. "I take my orders directly from the legal department, sir. And the legal department just informed me 5 minutes ago that you have been placed on immediate administrative leave. If you wish to go up to the 50th floor, you will have to use the standard employee elevators and check in at the front desk, just like any other regular visitor." The absolute humiliation of standing in the main lobby was almost too much for Richard to bear. Dozens of lower-level employees were walking past them, whispering to each other and pointing discreetly. The untouchable Grayson family was suddenly standing behind a velvet rope, completely locked out of their own ivory tower. Connor grabbed Richard's arm, pushing him toward the public elevators. "We do not have time to argue with a minimum wage guard," Richard Connor hissed, sweating profusely. "Just swallow your pride and get us upstairs so we can transfer the funds before the bank locks everything down permanently." The 4 of them squeezed into a crowded employee elevator. Vanessa covered her face with her designer handbag, trying to hide from the curious stares of the corporate analysts and marketing assistants standing next to them. Brianna kept her head down, staring blankly at her expensive shoes. The elevator ride felt like it took an absolute eternity, stopping at almost every single floor to let people on and off. Richard stared blankly at the digital floor indicator, his chest tightening with every passing second, as he was forced to share breathing room with the very people he had always considered beneath him. When the doors finally opened on the 50th floor, Richard pushed his way aggressively past the other passengers and stormed down the long carpeted hallway toward the chief executive's suite. He expected to find confused secretaries and panicked board members. He expected to march into his massive office, pick up his landline, and scream at the legal team until they reinstated his unlimited power. He threw open the heavy glass double doors of the main executive office, completely ignoring the receptionist, who called out for him to stop and wait. Richard stormed into his private office, ready to unleash his full fury, but the angry words died instantly in his dry throat. The massive room with its floor-to-ceiling panoramic views of the city was not empty, and his heavy mahogany desk was certainly not unoccupied. Sitting directly in the center of the plush leather executive chair, with her hands neatly folded over a thick stack of corporate financial ledgers, was Sydney. She was wearing a sharp-tailored charcoal suit, her hair pulled back into a sleek professional bun. She looked entirely in her element, radiating a quiet, terrifying authority. Standing on either side of the desk were three serious-looking men in dark navy suits. They were not company employees. They wore the distinct identification badges of an independent federal forensic auditing firm. Sydney looked up slowly as her entire family stumbled awkwardly into the room. Her face was completely calm, completely devoid of the anger and humiliation she had felt just 12 hours ago when they locked her in her childhood bedroom. She did not yell. She did not gloat. She simply looked at my father with the cold, clinical precision of someone examining a very flawed spreadsheet. "You are late," Richard Sidney said softly, her calm voice echoing clearly across the massive, silent office. "But I suppose we can officially begin the audit now that you are finally here." Richard stood completely frozen in the doorway of the executive suite, his mouth hanging open in pure shock. He could not comprehend what he was looking at. His daughter, the one he had publicly humiliated and banished to her room the night before, was now sitting comfortably behind the most powerful desk in the building. Before Richard could even find his voice to speak, Connor pushed aggressively past him. Connor's face was a twisted mask of intense panic and violent anger. The fake tech bro persona was completely gone, replaced by the frantic energy of a cornered criminal. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Sydney Connor shouted, pointing a shaking finger at her. "Get out of that chair right this instant. You have absolutely no right to be in this building, let alone sitting in the chief executive office looking at private corporate financials. I am calling the police right now and having you arrested for trespassing and corporate espionage." Sydney did not flinch. She did not even blink. She simply leaned back in the luxurious leather chair and looked at Connor with an expression of absolute profound pity. "You are not in any position to be making threats, Connor," she said, her voice smooth and chillingly calm. "And before you reach for your phone to call the authorities, you should probably say hello to the three gentlemen standing right next to me. They are senior investigators from the Federal Financial Regulatory Commission, and they are here this morning at my direct personal invitation." Connor's hand froze halfway to his pocket. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a sick ghost. He stared at the three men in the dark navy suits. They were not security guards that he could intimidate. They were federal agents holding thick leather-bound portfolios filled with every single financial mistake Connor had ever made. Richard finally found his voice, though it was weak and trembling. "Sydney, what is going on here?" Richard stammered, leaning heavily against the heavy glass doorframe. "Why are federal auditors standing in my private office?" "It is my office now, Richard." Sydney corrected him softly, her eyes never leaving Connor's panicked face. And they are here because your golden son-in-law has been using Grayson Logistics as his own personal piggy bank to fund a massive illegal criminal enterprise. That is a complete lie, Connor shrieked, his voice cracking with sheer desperation. He turned wildly toward Richard and Vanessa, waving his hands in the air. Do not listen to a single word she says, Richard. She is completely insane. She is just a bitter, jealous woman making up crazy stories because she wants to ruin my life. She is just a low-level software developer. She does not understand anything about high-level corporate finance or venture capital funding. Sydney slowly stood up from the heavy mahogany desk. That is where you made your first and most fatal miscalculation, Connor, she said, her voice cutting through the tense air of the room like a razor blade. You assumed I was just an ordinary tech worker because you never actually bothered to ask what I do for a living. My father never asked. My mother never asked. None of you ever cared enough about my life to know my actual profession. The entire family stared at her in stunned silence. Vanessa clutched her designer handbag to her chest, her eyes wide with growing terror. I am a senior forensic accountant, Sydney stated clearly, the words echoing loudly across the massive room. My entire professional career is dedicated exclusively to tracking down hidden corporate assets, exposing white-collar crime, and dismantling complex international fraud networks. I have personally sent billionaire executives to federal prison for trying to hide their dirty money. Your little accounting tricks, Connor, were the financial equivalent of a greedy toddler trying to hide stolen candy under a glass table. Sydney reached out and opened the thick black folder resting on the desk in front of her. She pulled out a massive stack of printed spreadsheets, the exact documents she had downloaded onto her encrypted drive the night before. Let us talk about your brilliant $5 million venture capital deal. Connor, she said, sliding the heavy stack of papers across the polished wood surface. There never was any venture capital firm. There were no outside investors. The entire tech startup was a completely fabricated lie, a massive fairy tale you spun to flatter my father's massive ego, so he would give you unrestricted access to the corporate bank accounts. Brianna stepped forward, her voice trembling violently. Connor, what is she talking about? Brianna whimpered, looking at her husband with desperate, pleading eyes. Tell her she is lying. Connor, tell them about your software app. Connor did not look at his wife. He was staring at the federal auditors, his chest heaving with panicked breaths. Shut up, Brianna, he hissed viciously, completely dropping the loving husband act. He needed that unrestricted access because he is currently drowning in $2 million of illegal sports gambling debt. Sydney continued, ignoring Brianna's tears. He owes a massive amount of money to very dangerous people in the criminal underworld. His brilliant master plan was to use our family company name to quietly set up 3 offshore shell companies in the Cayman Islands. Sydney tapped her manicured index finger against the top page of the spreadsheet, highlighting a series of red numbers. He was going to authorize a $5 million international wire transfer this morning, disguised as legitimate seed funding for his fake software launch. His plan was to use $2 million to quietly pay off his violent bookies and then pocket the remaining $3 million for himself. He was going to take the cash and run, leaving Brianna behind, and leaving Grayson Logistics to take the massive financial hit. Richard's legs finally gave out completely. He collapsed into one of the plush visitor chairs, clutching his chest as if he were having a heart attack. He was stealing from us. Richard whispered, his voice hollow and broken. He was going to bankrupt my father's company. It is much worse than bankruptcy, Richard, Sydney replied, her tone devoid of any sympathy. He was actively using Grayson Logistics to launder dirty money across international borders. If I had not flagged those illegal transactions and permanently shut down the wire transfer last night, the federal government would have raided this entire building by noon today. You would have been arrested and marched out of here in handcuffs as an active accomplice to federal wire fraud and money laundering. The federal prosecutors would have held you personally responsible because your executive signature was the one authorizing all of his access. Sydney walked slowly around the desk, stopping right in front of her father. She looked down at the broken man who had tormented her for decades. I did not sabotage his fake business deal because I was a jealous sister. I blocked his illegal transfer to save my grandfather's legacy from being entirely seized and destroyed by the federal government. I saved you from spending the rest of your miserable life inside a maximum security federal prison. And your immediate response to me saving your life was to lock me in my childhood bedroom, demand an apology, and attempt to freeze all of my bank accounts so I would starve on the streets. The massive executive office fell into a dead, suffocating silence. The only sound was Connor's rapid, frantic breathing as he backed slowly toward the glass doors, realizing there was absolutely no way out. The golden boy, the brilliant tech entrepreneur they had all worshipped over the dinner table, was nothing but a pathetic criminal parasite. And the daughter they had treated like absolute garbage for 32 years was the only reason they were not all wearing orange prison jumpsuits. Brianna broke the suffocating silence with a loud, piercing scream. She lunged forward, grabbing the edge of the heavy mahogany desk. "You are lying, Sydney!" Brianna shrieked, her face twisted in a mixture of profound terror and vicious denial. "You printed these fake spreadsheets just to ruin my marriage. Connor is a genius. He is building a software empire. He loves me, and he would never steal from our family. You are just a bitter, lonely woman who cannot stand the fact that I found a perfect husband while you have absolutely nobody." Connor grabbed his wife's arm, nodding frantically, agreeing with every delusional word she said. "Listen to her," Richard Connor pleaded, turning his desperate eyes back to my father. "Sydney hacked into the servers and manipulated the data to frame me. You know how vindictive she is. She planned this entire elaborate setup just to steal the company from you." The three federal auditors standing beside me did not say a single word. They simply looked at Connor with the cold, detached professionalism of men who had heard every pathetic excuse from desperate criminals 1,000 times before. Sydney did not raise her voice. She did not defend herself against Brianna's venomous insults. She slowly closed the thick black financial folder and leaned forward, resting her elbows on the polished wood. "You still do not understand how forensic accounting works, do you?" Brianna Sydney asked, her voice echoing softly but firmly across the massive executive suite. "When people like your husband launder $2 million to illegal offshore accounts, they do not just leave a trail of numbers. They leave a trail of communications. They send emails. They make phone calls. They leave voicemails. And when a federal judge signs a subpoena, we get to listen to every single word." Sydney reached over to the sleek computerized console built into the edge of the executive desk. She tapped the touchscreen, activating the high-definition surround sound speakers installed in the ceiling of the office. "I want you to listen very closely to this," Brianna Sydney said, looking directly into her sister's tear-filled eyes. "This is a recorded phone call Connor made at 2 in the morning last Tuesday. He was standing on the balcony of your luxury condo while you were asleep in the bedroom. He was talking to a woman named Ashley, a white Pilates instructor he has been secretly renting an apartment for on the north side of the city for the past 8 months." Connor let out a strangled gasp. His eyes widened in sheer, absolute panic. "No!" he yelled, lunging toward the desk to grab the console. "Stop it! Do not play that!" One of the federal auditors stepped forward instantly, placing a heavy, firm hand squarely on Connor's chest and pushing him forcefully back. "Step away from the desk right now, sir," the agent commanded, his deep voice leaving zero room for argument. Sydney pressed the play button. A soft static crackle filled the massive office, followed by the crystal-clear sound of Connor's voice echoing from the ceiling speakers. "I know, babe, I know." Connor sounded exhausted but arrogant on the recording. "You just have to be patient for a few more weeks. The wire transfer is almost completely set up. Once the old man signs off on the seed funding for my fake app, I am going to route the money straight to the Caymans." A high-pitched woman's voice answered him, giggling softly. "Are you sure you can pull this off, Connor? What if your wife finds out? She is always posting those annoying couple photos of you two online." Connor's cruel laughter echoed through the silent corporate office. "Oh, please," he scoffed loudly. "Brianna is completely clueless. She is just a stupid black doll. I dress up in designer clothes to keep her wealthy parents happy." The girl has absolutely nothing inside her head but makeup tutorials and shopping lists. She is my personal goldmine. I tolerate her annoying whining because her idiot father is handing me the keys to his entire transportation empire. As soon as the 3 million clears the offshore account, I am filing for divorce and booking us a one-way first-class ticket to Monaco. She can keep the fake Instagram life. I am taking the cash. Sydney tapped the screen, stopping the audio file. The brutal silence that followed was heavy enough to crush bone. Brianna stood frozen, her perfectly manicured hands trembling violently at her sides. The color completely drained from her face, leaving her looking like a hollow, shattered porcelain doll. The golden child, the beloved youngest daughter, had just heard the absolute, undeniable truth about her perfect fairy tale marriage. Her husband did not just lie to her about his business. He despised her. He used her race, her vanity, and her wealthy family as a calculated stepping stone for his own greedy survival. Connor backed away from his wife, shaking his head rapidly. "Baby, listen to me," he stammered, holding his hands up defensively. "That audio is fake. It is heavily edited. She used artificial intelligence to copy my voice. You know I would never say those horrible things about you." Brianna did not scream this time. She let out a quiet, agonizing whimper that sounded like a wounded animal. She took a slow, unsteady step backward, moving entirely away from the man she had proudly defended just 2 minutes prior. Richard sat paralyzed in the visitor chair, staring at Connor with a look of pure, murderous hatred. The patriarch of the Grayson family had finally realized that his blind, arrogant favoritism had invited a racist, manipulative parasite directly into his home. He had handed the keys to his father's legacy to a man who mocked them behind their backs. But before Richard could say a word, before the federal agents could formally begin reading, Connor his rights? A loud, dramatic gasp shattered the tension in the room. Vanessa suddenly clutched the collar of her expensive silk blouse. She stumbled backward, hitting the glass wall of the office, and slowly slid down to the floor. "Oh my chest!" Vanessa cried out, her voice perfectly pitched for maximum theatrical effect. "Richard, help me, I cannot breathe. The pain is unbearable." She began taking rapid, shallow breaths, fluttering her eyelashes, and clutching her left arm. Vanessa knew exactly what she was doing. The pristine social image of the Grayson family was completely imploding. Her precious son-in-law was a racist criminal fraud. Her youngest daughter was publicly humiliated. Her husband was completely stripped of his power. And the daughter she had neglected her entire life was now holding the executioner's axe. Vanessa could not handle the loss of control, so she used the only weapon she had left in her arsenal: absolute emotional manipulation. Richard snapped out of his paralyzed state and rushed to his wife's side, dropping to his knees. "Vanessa!" he yelled, panic replacing his anger. "Hold on, darling, I am right here." Brianna snapped out of her shock and ran to her mother, kneeling beside her and crying hysterically. "Mom, please hold on, we need an ambulance," she sobbed, looking up at Sydney with hateful, tear-filled eyes. "Look what you did, Sydney. You are killing our mother with your cruel lies. Stop this right now before she has a fatal heart attack." The federal auditors exchanged a brief skeptical look, clearly recognizing the fake medical emergency for exactly what it was: a desperate attempt to derail a federal investigation. Sydney stood perfectly still behind the massive mahogany desk, looking down at the pathetic scene unfolding on her office floor. She watched her mother dramatically gasping for air. She watched her father hovering anxiously. She watched her sister weaponizing their mother's fake illness to avoid facing the reality of her own shattered life. "You can stop the performance," Vanessa Sydney said, her voice completely flat and devoid of any emotion. "The paramedics are already on their way up. I called building security the moment you all stepped onto the elevator. But a fake heart attack is not going to stop the federal government from freezing your assets, and it is certainly not going to stop me from taking out the garbage." The paramedics arrived exactly 3 minutes later, carrying their heavy medical equipment into my new office. They checked Vanessa's vitals, only to find a perfectly steady resting heart rate and absolutely flawless blood pressure. The federal auditors did not even look up from their laptops as my mother was awkwardly escorted out of the building on a stretcher, hiding her face behind her designer handbag. Richard and Brianna followed closely behind her, their heads bowed in absolute defeat. Connor was already gone, having slipped out the emergency stairwell the moment the audio recording finished playing. For the next 48 hours, I completely transformed Grayson Logistics. I worked directly with the federal agents, turning over every single piece of evidence regarding Connor's offshore accounts. The banking freeze remained in full effect. My family was entirely locked out of the empire they had abused for so long. Then on Wednesday afternoon, I received a handwritten note delivered directly to my executive assistant. It was from my mother. She requested my presence for a private luncheon at the Oak Grove Country Club. Oak Grove was an ultra-exclusive playground for the Chicago elite, a place where Vanessa had spent decades cultivating her flawless social image. I knew exactly why she wanted to meet there. She wanted home court advantage. She wanted to use the crushing weight of high society expectations to force me into submission. I arrived at the country club promptly at noon, wearing a sharp navy blue tailored suit. The dining room was a sea of pastel dresses, pearl necklaces, and quiet, judgmental whispers. As I walked across the plush carpet, I could feel the eyes of dozens of wealthy socialites burning into my back. The rumors about our family had already started spreading through their tight-knit circles. Women who had ignored me my entire life were suddenly pausing their conversations to stare at me over their champagne flutes. Vanessa was sitting at a prime corner table overlooking the manicured green lawn of the 18th hole. She looked absolutely radiant, wearing a pristine white silk dress and a massive diamond tennis bracelet. There was absolutely no trace of the woman who had faked a heart attack on my office floor just 2 days prior. She took a slow, elegant sip of her sparkling water and smiled warmly at a passing country club board member before turning her cold, dead eyes toward me. "You are looking well, Mother," I said softly, unfolding my linen napkin and placing it on my lap. "Your miraculous recovery is truly inspiring to us all." Vanessa did not smile. Her eyes were calculating, entirely devoid of any maternal warmth. She leaned forward, resting her manicured hands on the crisp white tablecloth. "Let us skip the sarcastic pleasantries, Sydney," she whispered. Her voice kept purposefully low so the neighboring tables could not hear our conversation. "You have had your little moment of revenge. You embarrassed your father. You ruined your sister's marriage. You proved to everyone how smart you are. Now it is time to put an end to this ridiculous tantrum before you destroy our family name permanently." I looked at her in mild disbelief. "A tantrum?" I repeated, my tone completely calm. "Your golden boy son-in-law was stealing millions of dollars from the family business to pay off violent criminals, and you call stopping him a tantrum." "He made a financial mistake," Vanessa said, waving her hand dismissively, as if laundering dirty money was akin to accidentally spilling a glass of red wine on a rug. "We could have handled it quietly internally without making a massive public scene. But you just had to bring the federal government into our private affairs. You humiliated us, Sydney. This Saturday night is the grand 30th anniversary gala for Grayson Logistics. The mayor of Chicago will be there. The governor will be there. I will not allow you to stand on that stage and embarrass our legacy any further." I signaled a passing waiter and ordered a simple black coffee. "I am the chief executive officer, Vanessa. I am the only one who will be standing on that stage. None of you are invited to the gala." Vanessa reached down into her expensive leather tote bag and pulled out a thick manila folder. She slid it slowly across the table until it rested right in front of me. "I think you will change your mind after you read what is inside that folder," she said, a wicked, toxic smile creeping onto her face. I opened the heavy folder. Inside were several pages of official-looking medical documents printed on the letterhead of a very prominent and highly expensive private psychiatric clinic in the city. I scanned the dense text. The documents detailed a long, fake history of severe mental instability, paranoid delusions, and erratic manic episodes. At the bottom of the final page was a forged signature from a licensed corrupt psychiatrist, concluding that I was completely mentally unfit to manage any personal or corporate assets. I looked up from the papers, staring into the dark void of my mother's eyes. You forged medical records? I stated, my voice remaining completely flat despite the sheer unadulterated evil of her plan. I paid a very generous donation to a doctor who happens to be a close personal friend of mine. Vanessa corrected me, taking another casual sip of her water. Those records are officially filed in a secure medical database, Sydney. If you do not sign the controlling shares of the trust back over to your father before the gala on Saturday night, I am going to accidentally leak this entire folder to the press and the corporate board of directors. She leaned closer, her voice dripping with pure venom. You are a forensic accountant, Sydney. Your entire career, your professional reputation, your entire identity is built on your flawless credibility and your sound, rational judgment. What do you think will happen to your precious career when the Wall Street Journal runs a front-page story claiming you had a psychotic break and stole your father's company because you suffer from severe paranoid delusions? No one will ever hire you again. The federal auditors will immediately question all of your findings on Connor. The probate court will completely invalidate your grandfather's trust. You will lose absolutely everything you have ever worked for. I sat there listening to the bustling, wealthy sounds of the country club around us. Women were laughing and clinking crystal glasses, entirely unaware of the absolute monster sitting across from me. My own mother, the woman who brought me into this world, was actively willing to permanently destroy my professional life, my credibility and my sanity, just so she could keep wearing designer dresses and attending expensive parties. You have exactly 48 hours. Sydney, Vanessa said, standing up from the table and smoothing out her pristine white dress. Bring the transfer documents to the gala. Sign the company back to Richard where it belongs. If you do, we will quietly put you away in a nice, comfortable private facility until this all blows over and the press forgets about you. If you refuse my generous offer, I will utterly destroy you. She picked up her designer bag and walked away, leaving me alone at the table. She honestly thought she had trapped me in a corner. She thought the threat of public humiliation would break me, but she forgot one very important detail about forensic accountants. We always keep our receipts. I sat at the table for a few more minutes, finishing my black coffee. I paid the bill and walked out of the opulent dining room, leaving the whispers of the wealthy socialites behind me. The afternoon air was thick and humid as I made my way toward the underground parking garage of the country club. My heels clicked rhythmically against the concrete floor, echoing in the dimly lit space. I reached into my purse for my car keys, my mind already formulating a legal counterattack against Vanessa's forged medical records. But before I could unlock my car, a tall figure stepped out from behind a concrete pillar blocking my path. It was Connor. He looked absolutely pathetic. The custom-tailored suit he usually wore was wrinkled and stained with sweat. His expensive leather shoes were scuffed and his hair was an uncombed, greasy mess. He was twitching slightly, his eyes darting around the empty parking garage like a hunted animal. The arrogant tech bro who had confidently winked at me just 3 days ago was entirely gone. Standing in front of me was a desperate coward whose time had completely run out. "Get out of my way, Connor," I said, my voice echoing sharply in the empty garage. "I have absolutely nothing to say to you. My lawyers will handle your divorce settlement with Brianna, and the federal agents will handle your criminal charges." I tried to step around him, but he moved quickly, blocking the driver's side door of my car. He raised both hands in a frantic, pleading gesture. "Wait, Sydney, please. Just listen to me for 2 minutes." Connor begged, his voice cracking with sheer panic. "You do not understand what is happening. You do not understand who I am dealing with. I do not care about the divorce. I do not care about Brianna, or Richard, or your insane mother. I just need the money, Sydney. I need the $2 million right now." I crossed my arms over my chest, staring at him with absolute disgust. "You stole from my family," I replied coldly. "You used our corporate accounts to wash your dirty money. You think I am going to open the vault and hand you a severance package for your criminal behavior?" Connor grabbed his own hair, tugging at the roots. His face was pale and slick with nervous sweat. They are going to kill me, Sydney. He choked out the words tumbling from his mouth in a frantic rush. The syndicate I owe the money to. They are not bankers. They are violent, dangerous people. The deadline is tomorrow night. If I do not wire the $2 million to their offshore account by tomorrow, they are going to find me. They already sent guys to watch my apartment. I have not slept in 2 days. That sounds like a personal problem, Connor, I said, entirely unmoved by his tears. You should have thought about the consequences before you decided to play high-stakes gambling with money you did not have. Connor's panicked expression suddenly shifted. The desperate pleading left his eyes replaced by a dark, malicious glint. He dropped his hands to his sides, and his posture straightened slightly. He reached into the inside pocket of his wrinkled suit jacket and pulled out a small silver flash drive. I knew you would say that, Connor sneered, his voice dropping to a harsh, threatening whisper. I knew you would not care if I ended up dead in an alley. But I also know the one thing in this world you actually do care about. He held the silver flash drive up so it caught the dim fluorescent light of the parking garage. You worshipped your grandfather? Connor continued, stepping closer to me. Old Harrison Grayson was the only person in your toxic family who ever treated you with an ounce of respect. He was your hero. He built Grayson Logistics from a single delivery truck into a billion-dollar empire. His legacy is absolutely spotless. I stiffened, my jaw clenching tightly. Do not talk about my grandfather, Connor. You are not worthy to even speak his name. Connor let out a dry, hollow laugh. Oh, I am going to do a lot more than speak his name, Sydney. I spent the last 6 months digging through the old corporate archives while Richard was busy playing golf. I had full administrative access, remember. I found old tax ledgers and I altered them. I spent hours carefully doctoring decades of financial records, completely rewriting the history of Grayson Logistics. A cold chill ran down my spine. What did you do? I asked, my voice low and dangerous. I created a paper trail. A very convincing, very damning paper trail, Connor said, a sick smile spreading across his face. This flash drive contains thousands of forged documents that prove your beloved Grandpa Harrison committed massive federal tax evasion during the early years of the company. The documents show he routinely bribed city officials, underpaid his workers, and funneled millions into illegal offshore accounts. It is a complete lie, of course, but it is a lie backed up by incredibly sophisticated financial forgeries that will take the federal government years to untangle. He took another step forward, invading my personal space. If you do not unfreeze the corporate accounts and authorize my $2 million wire transfer by tomorrow afternoon, I am sending copies of this flash drive to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Internal Revenue Service, and every major news outlet in Chicago. Connor threatened, his eyes wide and manic. They will completely tear your grandfather's legacy apart. His name will be dragged through the mud. The city will strip his name off the children's hospital he funded. The government will freeze the entire trust and seize the company pending a massive historical fraud investigation. Your perfect grandfather will be remembered as a corrupt criminal mastermind. I stared at him, the anger boiling hot and violent in my veins. My mother had just threatened to destroy my own life, and I had not even blinked. But Connor was aiming for Harrison. He was threatening to destroy the only pure thing in my life, the memory of the man who had loved and protected me. Connor knew exactly where to strike to inflict the maximum amount of pain. You are a disgusting, pathetic coward, I whispered, my hands balling into tight fists at my sides. I am a survivor. Connor spat back his breath, smelling stale and sour. I will do whatever it takes to stay alive. You have until tomorrow afternoon, Sydney. Unlock the Cayman Islands sub-account and let the $2 million clear. You get to keep the company, your grandfather keeps his spotless reputation, and I get to pay off the syndicate and disappear forever. Nobody gets hurt. He tossed the silver flash drive onto the hood of my car. It landed with a sharp metallic clink. Think about it very carefully, Sydney, Connor said, backing away into the shadows of the concrete pillars. $2 million is a very small price to pay to protect the only man who ever loved you. Do not make a mistake. You will regret for the rest of your life. He turned and quickly disappeared into the dark stairwell of the parking garage, leaving me standing alone in the quiet underground silence. I looked down at the silver flash drive resting on my car. Connor's threat was real, and the damage to Harrison's legacy would be catastrophic if those documents leaked. The coward thought he had finally found my breaking point. He thought I would crumble under the weight of my grandfather's memory. But Connor was about to learn that you never blackmail a forensic accountant with financial documents. I looked down at the small silver piece of plastic resting on the cold metal of my car hood. Connor stood a few feet away, watching me closely from the shadows. He was waiting for my reaction, waiting to see if his desperate gamble was going to pay off. As a forensic accountant, I knew exactly how easily a well-crafted forgery could temporarily derail a legacy. A federal investigation into Harrison Grayson would freeze the company assets for years. But more importantly, I knew that Connor was a cornered rat. If I pushed him into a wall right now, he might actually leak the documents out of pure spite before the federal agents could secure him. I needed him to feel safe. I needed him to think he held the winning hand so he would walk directly into his own federal prison cell. I let my shoulders slump forward. I forced my hands to shake slightly as I reached out and picked up the flash drive. I looked up at Connor, making sure my eyes portrayed absolute defeat and panic. "You cannot do this, Connor," I whispered, letting my voice crack just enough to sound completely broken. "My grandfather was a good man. He built this company to provide for us. If you release these documents, the government will destroy everything he worked for." Connor stepped out of the shadows, a sickeningly arrogant smile spreading across his pale, sweaty face. He puffed out his chest, suddenly feeling like the powerful tech bro millionaire he always pretended to be. "I do not want to destroy his legacy, Sydney," he said, his voice dripping with fake sympathy. "I just want what is rightfully mine. I want my $2 million so I can pay off my investors and move on with my life. You unlock the account, and this flash drive is the only copy that will ever exist. I will hand over the master files and walk away." I closed my eyes, taking a deep, shaky breath, playing the role of the defeated sister perfectly. "Fine," I said, looking down at the concrete floor. "You win, Connor. I will not let you ruin my grandfather's name over your filthy gambling debts, but you are not getting unlimited access to the main corporate funds. The federal auditors are watching those accounts too closely. There is a specific sub-account, an old vendor payment line we use for international shipping contractors. I will quietly unlock that specific sub-account and authorize a single wire transfer limit of exactly $2 million. Connor's eyes lit up with pure, greedy relief. He ran a hand through his greasy hair, nodding rapidly. "That works," he said quickly. "As long as the money clears by tomorrow afternoon, I do not care which account it comes from." "It will be unlocked by 8 in the morning," I told him, gripping my car keys tightly. "But you have to promise me, Connor. You delete every single forged file, you never speak of this tax evasion lie again, and you stay far away from the press. If you break this deal, I swear I will let the federal government bury you." Connor laughed, a loud, obnoxious sound that echoed in the empty garage. "Do not worry, Sydney," he sneered, adjusting the lapels of his wrinkled suit jacket. "I am a man of my word. Just make sure the money is ready tomorrow. I have a gala to attend on Saturday night, and I want to celebrate my success with a clear conscience." He turned and strutted away, his confidence completely restored, leaving me alone in the dim garage. I watched him walk away, dropping my fake, terrified expression the second his back was turned. My hands stopped shaking. My posture straightened. Connor thought he had just successfully blackmailed a corporate investigator. He had no idea he had just actively agreed to commit a massive federal crime using a monitored account. By that evening, the news of Connor's supposed victory had clearly reached the rest of the family. They did not know the details of his blackmail, but they knew he had somehow forced me to bend the knee. Vanessa, Richard, Brianna, and Connor genuinely believed they had won the war. They thought my mother's threat with the fake medical records and Connor's fake tax evasion documents had completely terrified me into returning their stolen empire. Instead of lying low or preparing for the legal fallout, they immediately reverted to their absolute worst materialistic habits. The very next morning, Brianna and Vanessa went on a massive shopping spree on the Magnificent Mile. Since their Grayson Logistics credit cards were still technically frozen, they used Brianna's personal influencer credit lines, maxing them out under the arrogant assumption that I would be returning their unlimited corporate wealth by the weekend. Brianna purchased a $30,000 custom designer gown for the upcoming 30th anniversary gala. Vanessa bought matching diamond earrings and a ridiculously expensive tuxedo for Richard. They strutted through the high-end boutiques laughing loudly, drinking complimentary champagne and treating the retail workers like absolute garbage. They were celebrating their glorious return to power. They were eagerly planning exactly how they were going to humiliate me at the gala on Saturday night, once the transfer was complete and they had the company back in their greedy hands. Back at the mansion, Richard was pacing the grand study, smoking an expensive cigar. He was already drafting the speech he planned to give at the gala. He was writing a public announcement that I was stepping down due to severe mental health issues, and that Connor was officially stepping in as his new executive vice president. Richard was so completely blinded by his own ego that he never once stopped to question why I would surrender so easily. He just assumed his natural authority as the patriarch had finally broken my rebellious spirit. Meanwhile, Connor was secretly packing a luxury leather duffel bag in his closet. He had absolutely no intention of staying with Brianna once the $2 million cleared the offshore account. He was booking a private jet charter to Monaco, dreaming of his new life, far away from his annoying wife and her dramatic family. He thought he was the smartest man in the entire city. He thought he had outplayed everyone, the dangerous syndicate, my arrogant father, and me. What none of them realized was that the sub-account I promised to unlock for Connor was not a secret company slush fund. It was a highly restricted federal honeypot account, specifically designed and monitored by the Federal Bureau of Investigation to track international money laundering networks. Connor was not walking away with $2 million. He was walking directly into a federal trap and taking the entire Grayson family ego down with him. I drove away from the country club parking garage and headed straight back to the Grayson Logistics corporate tower. The downtown traffic was heavy, but my mind was completely clear. As soon as I stepped into the secure executive suite, I locked the heavy glass doors behind me. I walked over to the mahogany desk and opened the secure encrypted laptop provided to me by the Federal Financial Regulatory Commission. I plugged in my security key and initiated a secure encrypted phone call to Special Agent Davis, the lead investigator assigned to Connor's money laundering case. The line connected with a soft, electronic beep. "Is the bait in the water, Agent?" Davis asked, his voice calm and strictly professional, echoing slightly through the secure speaker. "The bait has been swallowed whole," I replied, leaning back in the plush leather chair. Connor took the deal exactly as we anticipated. He believes he successfully blackmailed me using forged tax documents about my grandfather. He thinks I unlocked the old offshore vendor sub-account to let him wire the $2 million to his syndicate. I could hear the faint sound of typing on the other end of the line. "Excellent work," Sydney Agent Davis said. "My cyber team just verified the system access. We see his IP address repeatedly pinging the honeypot server. He is logging in to check the balance. Let me explain exactly how a federal honeypot trap works, for those who might not understand the complexities of forensic accounting. When a criminal attempts to launder millions of dollars across international borders, they look for blind spots. They look for accounts with minimal oversight hidden behind shell companies in countries with loose banking regulations like the Cayman Islands. Connor thought the sub-account I gave him access to was a forgotten corporate slush fund. It looked completely authentic to the untrained eye. It had the correct international routing numbers, the proper Grayson Logistics, corporate identifiers, and the exact balance of $2 million sitting there waiting to be moved. But the entire account was a digital mirage. It was an isolated sandbox environment created and hosted directly on Federal Bureau of Investigation servers. Every single keystroke Connor made, every password he entered, every account number he tried to verify, was being recorded in real time by a team of federal cyber agents. The money inside the account was not real corporate capital. It was federal tracking funds, designed specifically to trace the flow of illicit money back to the dangerous gambling syndicate he owed. The moment Connor hits the execute button to wire that money, he will not be transferring funds to his violent bookies. He will be permanently sealing his own federal indictment. Under federal law, the sheer act of attempting to wire those funds across international borders using a monitored account constitutes wire fraud, money laundering, and criminal conspiracy. When does he plan to initiate the transfer, Agent? Davis asked, bringing my attention back to the present moment. He told me he needs the funds to clear by tomorrow afternoon, I explained, looking at the calendar on my desk. But Connor is an arrogant narcissist. He wants to feel like he completely defeated me. Tomorrow night is the Grayson Logistics 30th anniversary gala. He will wait until the very last possible moment, probably right before my father gets on stage to give his grand speech. Connor wants to stand in that massive ballroom sipping expensive champagne, knowing he just stole $2 million right from under my nose. He will likely use his mobile phone to execute the transfer directly from the gala floor, just to feed his massive ego. That fits his psychological profile perfectly, Agent Davis agreed. My team will be on standby. We have tactical units ready to move the second the digital wire triggers the alarm on our end. We already have the arrest warrants drafted and signed by a federal judge. We are just waiting for him to push the button. I thanked Agent Davis and ended the secure call. The office was quiet again. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked down at the sprawling city of Chicago. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, dark shadows across the streets below. For the first time in my life, I did not feel a single ounce of guilt about what was going to happen to my family. Growing up, I had always internalized their cruelty. I thought that if I just worked harder, got better grades, or became more successful, they would finally love me the way they loved Brianna. I thought my father would eventually respect my intelligence. I thought my mother would eventually want to spend time with me instead of her country club friends. But this week had completely shattered those lingering childhood illusions. My mother had threatened to throw me into a psychiatric ward and permanently destroy my career, with forged medical records simply because I stopped her favorite son-in-law from stealing our money. Connor had threatened to completely destroy the legacy of the only man who ever loved me by framing my dead grandfather for tax evasion. And my father and sister were blindly cheering them on, completely consumed by their own shallow greed and entitlement. They were not my family. They were parasites feeding off a legacy they did not build and destroying anyone who tried to hold them accountable. I spent the rest of the evening preparing the necessary corporate documents for the aftermath. I drafted the official termination papers for Richard, officially removing him from any association with Grayson Logistics and stripping him of his executive pension. I finalized the legal separation of the family trust, ensuring that Vanessa and Brianna would never be able to access a single dime of my grandfather's money ever again. I worked systematically and coldly, leaving absolutely no legal loopholes for them to exploit. The trap was flawlessly set. The federal agents were watching the digital wires. The arrest warrants were signed and waiting in briefcases. All I had to do now was get dressed and attend a party. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out a simple, elegant black dress I had purchased years ago. It was not a $30,000 custom designer gown like the one Brianna had bought with stolen credit. It was understated sharp and commanded absolute respect. Tomorrow night, the Grayson family was going to walk into that grand ballroom expecting a glorious coronation. They were expecting to publicly humiliate me and reclaim their stolen throne before the eyes of the entire city. But they had absolutely no idea that the entire glamorous event was about to become the stage for their total and irreversible annihilation. I turned off the lights in the executive suite and locked the door behind me, completely ready for the final act to begin. I arrived at the grand ballroom of the Millennium Hotel exactly at 8 o'clock. The 30th anniversary gala for Grayson Logistics was the social event of the season. The massive room was draped in gold and black velvet with enormous crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceiling, casting a warm, expensive glow over the tables. Reporters and photographers from every major business publication in Chicago were crowded near the entrance, flashing their cameras as the city elite arrived. Mayors, city council members, and billionaire investors mingled, holding flutes of expensive champagne and discussing high-level corporate maneuvers. I walked quietly to my assigned seat at table number 1, directly in front of the main stage. I wore my simple black dress, blending into the shadows while my family prepared to blind everyone with their stolen wealth. I took a sip of sparkling water and waited. A sudden wave of applause erupted near the entrance. Richard and Vanessa made their grand arrival. Vanessa looked like a queen in her sparkling diamond earrings, smiling brightly for the cameras and waving at her country club friends. Richard walked beside her, his chest puffed out in his custom tuxedo, soaking up the adoration of the room as if he had personally built the empire from scratch. Right behind them were Brianna and Connor. Brianna was wearing the $30,000 designer gown she had bought on maxed-out credit just the day before. She looked absolutely radiant, completely oblivious to the fact that her husband despised her and her entire life was a fragile illusion built on lies. Connor wore a forced, confident smile, waving to the photographers, but I could see a slight nervous tremor in his hands. They made their way down the center aisle to the VIP table right next to mine. Brianna noticed me sitting there quietly. She stopped for a brief moment and shot me a glare of absolute triumphant superiority. She truly believed my silent presence meant I had completely surrendered. She thought I was sitting there waiting to publicly hand the company over to her husband, so my mother would not release the fake medical records to the press. Brianna gave a nasty little smirk and turned her back to me, taking her seat next to Connor. Connor did not even look at me. His eyes were fixated entirely on his mobile phone resting on his lap, hidden under the white silk tablecloth. He was sweating through his expensive dress shirt, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The elegant string quartet stopped playing. The lights in the ballroom slowly dimmed, and a bright spotlight hit the main stage. The crowd quieted down quickly as Richard walked confidently up the steps and stood behind the sleek glass podium. He adjusted the microphone, taking a deep breath and looking out over the sea of wealthy faces. He felt like an absolute god in that moment. "Welcome, distinguished guests, friends and family." Richard began, his deep voice echoing perfectly through the massive speakers. 30 years ago, my father, Harrison Grayson, started this company with nothing but a single delivery truck and an unstoppable dream. Tonight, we celebrate a legacy of excellence, power, and unyielding family strength. The crowd politely clapped. Vanessa dabbed a fake tear from her eye, playing the role of the devoted matriarch flawlessly. Richard continued his speech, weaving a massive web of lies about his own business brilliance. He talked extensively about how he had single-handedly guided the company through severe economic downturns, conveniently leaving out the fact that I was the one who had caught every major financial error he had ever made. He stood there basking in the unearned glory, completely intoxicated by his own massive ego and the sound of his own voice. As Richard spoke, I shifted my gaze to Connor. Under the table, his thumbs were moving rapidly across his glowing phone screen. He was logging into the secure banking portal I had provided him. He was navigating through the fake corporate prompts, bypassing the simulated security protocols, and entering the offshore routing numbers for his violent gambling syndicate. "This company has always been about looking toward the bright future," Richard announced, his voice growing louder and more passionate, filling the silent room. "And tonight, I am deeply thrilled to announce a monumental transition for the Grayson family. We are bringing a new visionary into the executive fold, a man who understands modern technology and global expansion, a man who has already proven himself to be a brilliant entrepreneur and a devoted husband to my beautiful daughter." The stage spotlight began to shift slightly, preparing to illuminate Connor at the VIP table. Brianna reached out and squeezed Connor's arm, beaming with absolute pride and whispering something in his ear. I watched Connor's thumb hover over the final confirmation button on his phone screen. The transfer amount was typed clearly $2 million. The destination was a blacklisted Cayman Island shell account. All he had to do was press send, and he believed the money would vanish into the untraceable criminal underworld, protecting his life and securing his escape. He looked up at the stage, watching his father-in-law sing his praises to the elite crowd. A sickeningly arrogant smile spread across Connor's pale face. He thought he had won everything. He thought he had blackmailed me successfully. He was getting the money. He was getting the prestigious executive title, and he was getting his absolute freedom from my sister. Connor pressed the execute button. I did not need to see his screen to know he did it. I felt my own mobile phone vibrate once inside my small clutch purse. It was an automated encrypted text message from Special Agent Davis. The message contained a single word: secured. Connor's wire transfer had just been successfully routed directly into the Federal Bureau of Investigation honeypot trap. The digital trigger had been pulled, and the massive invisible jaws of the federal government had just slammed shut around his neck. Richard raised both of his hands, gesturing grandly toward our table. Ladies and gentlemen, please direct your attention to my son-in-law, the new executive vice president of Grayson Logistics, Connor Davies. The ballroom erupted into thunderous applause. Connor quickly slipped his phone back into his jacket pocket and stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. He waved to the cheering crowd, basking in the overwhelming adulation. Brianna stood up right next to him, clapping enthusiastically and blowing elegant kisses to her wealthy friends in the audience. Vanessa leaned over the table and patted Connor's back, looking like the proudest mother in the world. They were entirely consumed by their own glamorous facade. They were standing at the absolute peak of their fake high society mountain, absorbing the cheers of the Chicago elite. They had absolutely no idea that beneath the elegant music and the popping champagne corks, the ground was completely collapsing beneath their feet. The crime was finalized, the digital evidence was permanently locked, and the federal agents were already walking through the heavy brass doors of the hotel lobby. Richard beamed under the bright stage lights, holding his hands up to quiet the thunderous applause. The adoring crowd slowly settled back into their seats, adjusting their expensive silk gowns and tailored suits. Connor remained standing for just a moment longer, soaking in the absolute admiration of the Chicago elite before sitting down next to my sister. Brianna leaned her head affectionately on his shoulder, a picture-perfect portrait of high society success. Vanessa raised her crystal champagne flute toward the stage, a tear of pure, arrogant pride shining on her cheek. I watched them all from the shadows of table number 1, my face completely expressionless. My phone buzzed one more time against my palm. The federal cyber team had successfully hijacked the hotel audio-visual system, just as we had planned. Now Richard continued, his booming voice echoing perfectly through the massive ballroom. We have prepared a short video presentation to honor the incredible 30-year history of Grayson Logistics. This video highlights the sacrifices my father made and the brilliant future my son-in-law Connor is about to build for all of us. Please direct your attention to the massive screen behind me. Richard stepped aside, gesturing grandly toward the enormous LED wall that spanned the entire width of the main stage. The ballroom lights dimmed down to a dramatic low glow. The string quartet stopped playing completely. Hundreds of wealthy guests turned their chairs, expecting to see a polished corporate documentary filled with uplifting music and historical photographs. The massive screen flickered on, but instead of a beautiful corporate logo, the screen displayed a stark black background with rapidly scrolling lines of green computer code. A confused murmur rippled through the elegant ballroom. Richard frowned, tapping his microphone. "Excuse me?" he said, looking nervously toward the audio-visual booth at the back of the room. "It seems we are having a slight technical difficulty. Please bear with us for just a moment." But it was not a technical difficulty. The scrolling code suddenly snapped away, replaced by a massive high-definition map of the world. A bright red line shot out from the city of Chicago, drawing a direct path across the ocean, all the way down to a tiny red dot located in the Cayman Islands. The whispers in the crowd grew louder. The mayor of Chicago, who was sitting at a table near the front, leaned forward in his chair, his brow furrowed in deep confusion. Corporate executives and rival business owners exchanged very concerned glances. This did not look like a corporate tribute video at all. This looked exactly like a high-level financial surveillance feed. I glanced over at the VIP table. Connor was no longer smiling. He was sitting frozen stiff, staring up at the massive screen with wide, terrified eyes. The color drained from his face at a rapid pace, leaving him looking incredibly sick. His hand slowly crept toward his jacket pocket where his phone was hidden. Suddenly, the map on the screen minimized, and a massive digital bank statement appeared in its place. The font was enormous, making every single detail perfectly visible to everyone in the room. The header of the document clearly displayed the name Grayson Logistics Offshore Vendor Account, along with the highly restricted federal routing numbers. Right below it was a real-time transaction log showing a pending outgoing wire transfer. The amount was listed in bold, glowing red numbers, $2 million. And right next to the transfer amount was the digital signature authorizing the illegal transaction. The name Connor Davies was plastered across the screen for the entire city to see. Richard turned around to look at the screen and his jaw dropped. His face instantly lost all of its arrogant warmth, turning a sickening shade of gray. He looked back at the crowd, then back at the screen, completely paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of what he was witnessing. He did not understand the complex computer code, but he understood the numbers. $2 million of company money was currently draining out of a restricted offshore account in real time right during his speech. "Connor," Brianna whispered, her voice trembling with sudden confusion. "Connor, what is that up on the screen? Why is your name on a bank transfer for $2 million? Connor did not answer her. He could not breathe. His expensive custom suit suddenly felt like a suffocating straitjacket. He looked wildly around the room, searching for an exit, but the grand ballroom was packed with hundreds of people blocking every single aisle. He looked down at me, sitting calmly at my table, sipping my sparkling water. He saw the empty, emotionless stare in my eyes, and the terrifying reality of his situation finally crashed down upon his shoulders. He knew exactly what I had done. He knew the vendor account I gave him was a federal trap, before Richard could even demand that the projectionists cut the video feed. A loud, blaring siren sound played through the massive ballroom speakers, making several older guests jump out of their seats in shock. A heavy graphic violently slammed down over the digital bank statement on the screen. The massive, bold red letters read, "Federal Indictment Warrant Issued for Wire Fraud and International Money Laundering." Beneath the text, the screen displayed a live tracking notification showing the exact Internet Protocol address that initiated the transfer. The address explicitly matched the public Wi-Fi network of the Millennium Hotel Grand Ballroom. It even pinpointed the specific device as Connor's personal mobile phone. The entire room erupted into absolute chaos. The polite, wealthy whispers instantly transformed into loud gasping and chaotic shouting. Reporters who had been sitting quietly near the back suddenly scrambled out of their chairs, pulling out their professional cameras and frantically snapping photos of the massive red indictment on the screen. The rapid camera flashes lit up the dark ballroom like a violent lightning storm, capturing every moment of the Grayson family downfall. Board members of Grayson Logistics stood up, pointing angrily at Richard, demanding to know what illegal activities he was running. Wealthy corporate investors, who had trusted my family with their capital, were pulling out their cell phones, frantically calling their legal teams. The flawless, pristine social image my mother had spent decades carefully cultivating was being utterly shredded to pieces in front of a live, unblinking audience. Vanessa dropped her crystal champagne flute. It shattered loudly against the hard marble floor, spraying expensive sparkling wine over her designer shoes. She clutched her pearl necklace, hyperventilating as the camera flashes blinded her. "Richard, help me!" she cried out, looking desperately toward the stage. "Richard, do something! Turn it off immediately!" But Richard could not do anything. He was standing frozen behind the glass podium, gripping the edges so hard his knuckles were entirely white. He looked like a terrified, lost old man. The Grand Emperor of Grayson Logistics had been completely stripped of his power, and he was currently standing completely exposed before the entire business world. Connor suddenly bolted out of his chair, knocking it backward onto the floor. He did not care about Brianna, who was now screaming his name. He did not care about his fake tech bro image anymore. His pure primal survival instinct completely took over. He tried to sprint toward the side exit doors, located near the catering kitchens, hoping to disappear into the dark service hallways before anyone could stop him. But Connor did not make it more than 10 feet. The heavy oak doors at the main entrance of the ballroom suddenly burst wide open, hitting the walls with a deafening crash that silenced the entire panicked crowd. The heavy oak doors at the main entrance of the ballroom burst wide open, hitting the walls with a deafening crash that silenced the entire panicked crowd. Connor froze in his tracks, his escape route completely cut off. A dozen federal agents wearing dark tactical windbreakers with the letters FBI, printed boldly in yellow across the back, poured into the room. They moved with swift military precision, instantly blocking every single exit and securing the perimeter of the grand ballroom. The entire room fell into a dead, terrified silence, broken only by the continuous flashing of press cameras. I stood up from my seat at table number 1. My simple black dress rustled softly as I walked up the carpeted stairs to the main stage. Richard was still standing paralyzed behind the sleek glass podium, gripping the edges with white knuckles. He looked at me as I approached, his eyes wide with a desperate, pleading panic. He looked like a broken, terrified old man who had suddenly forgotten how to speak. I did not offer him a single ounce of comfort. I reached out and firmly pried the microphone from his trembling fingers. He stepped backward, completely surrendering his fake throne without a fight. I turned to face the sea of wealthy investors, politicians, and elite socialites. The massive digital indictment was still glowing bright red on the screen behind me, casting a harsh light over the stage. I raised the microphone. My voice was calm, steady, and carried perfectly through the silent, cavernous room. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the sudden interruption to this evening. Celebrations, I began, my tone completely devoid of any panic or fear. My name is Sydney Grayson. I am the true Chief Executive Officer of Grayson Logistics and the sole primary beneficiary of the Harrison Grayson Blind Trust. The man you see trying to cower near the catering exit is my brother-in-law, Connor Davies. What you just witnessed on the screen behind me was not a technical glitch or a tasteless joke. It was the real-time execution of a federal sting operation. A loud collective gasp rippled through the audience. The mayor of Chicago sat back heavily in his chair, looking thoroughly shocked. Connor Davies attempted to wire $2 million of corporate capital to an illegal offshore sports gambling syndicate. I explained, breaking down the financial crime with cold, clinical precision. He believed he had successfully blackmailed me into unlocking a vulnerable corporate account. However, he was entirely unaware that the specific vendor account he accessed was a restricted federal honeypot trap monitored directly by the Cyber Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The United States government now has irrefutable digital evidence of his massive criminal conspiracy. I looked directly at the tables where our primary corporate investors were sitting. Their faces were pale with worry about their own financial stakes. I want to assure every shareholder and partner in this room that your investments are entirely secure, I stated firmly, projecting absolute corporate authority. I personally locked Richard Grayson out of the corporate banking infrastructure 2 days ago due to his gross administrative negligence. Not a single dime of actual company money was ever in danger. The Grayson Logistics legacy remains completely intact. Special Agent Davis walked straight down the center aisle of the ballroom, his eyes locked onto Connor. Connor let out a pathetic whimper and tried to run again, but 2 large federal agents immediately grabbed him. They threw him forcefully against a catered dining table. Crystal champagne glasses shattered onto the marble floor, sending expensive wine splashing everywhere. The cold metallic click of handcuffs echoed sharply through the quiet room as they locked Connor's wrists tightly behind his back. Agent Davis stood over him, reading him his Miranda rights in a loud, clear voice. Connor was openly weeping now, his arrogant tech bro facade completely dissolved into a puddle of pathetic, cowardly tears. He begged the agents to let him go, offering them fake money he did not even possess. They simply hauled him to his feet and dragged him toward the exit like a heavy bag of garbage. Brianna watched her husband being hauled away. Her jaw hung open in absolute disbelief. The $30,000 designer gown she wore suddenly looked entirely ridiculous. Her perfect influencer life, her wealthy status, her entire fake identity had just been incinerated in front of the most powerful people in Chicago. Her brain simply could not process the brutal truth. She refused to blame Connor, and she refused to blame her own massive vanity. Her mind desperately sought a scapegoat, and her tear-filled eyes locked directly onto me, standing calmly on the stage. A primal, animalistic scream ripped from Brianna's throat. She kicked off her expensive high heels and charged the stage. "You ruined my life!" she shrieked, her face contorted with violent, irrational rage. "You set him up, you jealous, toxic monster!" She scrambled up the stage stairs, her perfectly styled hair falling wildly around her face. She raised her hands, curling her manicured fingers into claws, aiming directly for my face. The audience screamed, expecting a violent physical brawl. I did not step back. I did not flinch. As she lunged at me, I simply raised my left arm and firmly caught her wrist, stopping her forward momentum completely. She struggled wildly like a spoiled child, but I held her in a vice grip. With my right hand, I reached into my small black clutch purse. I pulled out a thick folded legal document stamped heavily with the official blue seal of the Cook County Family Court. I shoved the heavy document hard against Brianna's chest, forcing her to take it. "Read it, Brianna," I commanded, my voice dropping to a cold, absolute whisper that only the two of us and our parents could hear. "Read what your brilliant, loving husband filed 30 days ago before any of this corporate drama even happened." She stopped struggling. She looked down at the thick paper, her hands shaking violently. She slowly opened the first page. The large, bold letters across the top read, "Unilateral petition for dissolution of marriage." "Connor secretly filed for divorce a month ago," I explained, watching the last remaining pieces of her soul shatter. He had already booked a private jet charter to Monaco for tomorrow morning. He was going to take the $2 million and leave you completely bankrupt and alone. The audio recording you heard in my office was not fake, Brianna. He never loved you. You were nothing but a convenient shield to him, a stupid doll he used to gain access to our father's bank accounts. The heavy legal document slipped from Brianna's trembling fingers and fluttered slowly to the stage floor. Her legs gave out completely. She collapsed onto her knees, the massive skirt of her expensive designer gown pooling around her like a deflated parachute. She stared blankly at the divorce papers, the absolute reality of her worthless existence finally breaking her mind. She had no loving husband, she had no corporate money, and she had no family empire to fall back on. The golden child was left with absolutely nothing. Vanessa let out a horrible wailing sob from her seat in the audience, covering her face with her hands in total public shame. Richard simply stared at the floor, his legacy and his massive ego entirely in ruins. The press continued to snap photos capturing the definitive end of the toxic Grayson family dynamic. I stood tall above them all, holding the microphone, feeling completely free. The empire belonged to me now, and the monsters were finally gone. 6 months have passed since the flashing cameras and the blaring sirens completely shattered the Grayson family facade at the Millennium Hotel. The bitter, freezing winter of Chicago has finally melted away, giving way to a bright, warm, and forgiving summer. The massive corporate scandal that dominated the front pages of the financial newspapers has slowly faded from the public eye, but the brutal consequences of that night permanently altered the landscape of our lives forever. I am standing alone in my spacious executive office on the 50th floor, looking out through the expansive floor-to-ceiling windows. The magnificent city stretches out endlessly below me, a vast, glowing grid of glass and steel shining brilliantly under the midday sun. The heavy, suffocating weight that pressed down on my chest for 32 years is entirely gone. I feel a profound, absolute sense of freedom. The legal and financial fallout from the gala was incredibly swift and absolutely merciless. Connor did not even make it to a federal trial. Faced with the overwhelming and undeniable digital evidence captured by the federal honeypot trap, his expensive defense attorneys immediately advised him to take a restrictive plea deal. He is currently serving a 15-year sentence in a maximum security federal penitentiary, far away from the luxurious penthouses and expensive restaurants he loved so much. There are no designer leather loafers or luxury sports cars in his new miserable reality. He spends his long, monotonous days sitting in a tiny concrete cell, completely stripped of his arrogant tech bro facade. The dangerous underground gambling syndicate he owed the $2 million to was systematically dismantled by the FBI shortly after his high-profile arrest, making his desperate, cowardly attempt to steal from my family entirely pointless. He gambled his freedom, his marriage, and his entire future, and he lost absolutely everything in a single night. My father, Richard, faced his own devastating reckoning. He was formally and unanimously removed from his position at Grayson Logistics by the corporate board of directors the very next morning. I did not even have to say a single word or raise my voice to push him out the door. The intense public humiliation and his explicit documented association with Connor's criminal activities made him a massive toxic liability to the shareholders. He was forced into immediate early retirement, stripped of his lucrative executive pension, and entirely locked out of the massive transportation empire he used to brag about endlessly. His wealthy, superficial friends at the exclusive country club immediately shunned him, refusing to return his desperate phone calls or invite him to their private golf tournaments. The untouchable, booming patriarch of the Grayson family now lives in a modest two-bedroom apartment in the quiet suburbs. He spends his empty days staring blankly at the television screen, his massive, fragile ego completely crushed under the crushing weight of his own profound failures. His expensive custom golf clubs are just gathering dust in a dark closet. Vanessa did not fare any better in the harsh light of reality. The moment the corporate accounts were legally secured and the blind trust was fully executed, she was entirely cut off from the massive fortune she had always treated as her own personal limitless piggy bank. The subsequent personal bankruptcy proceedings were brutal, humiliating, and highly public. She was forced by the courts to sell her pristine colonial mansion, her luxury imported vehicles, and almost every piece of expensive diamond jewelry she owned just to pay off her mounting astronomical credit card debts. She desperately tried to maintain her flawless high society image, but the wealthy, judgmental socialites she used to gossip with completely turned their backs on her. There are no more lavish charity galas or exclusive country club luncheons for Vanessa. She is just an ordinary, lonely woman living in the dark shadow of a luxurious life she never truly earned and could not manage to keep. She now spends her time trying to sell her old designer handbags on the internet just to pay her utility bills. And then there is Brianna, the golden child, the beloved youngest daughter who spent her entire pampered life stepping on my neck to elevate her own fragile status. Her flawless, carefully curated influencer career evaporated into thin air the exact moment the federal agents dragged her weeping husband out of the grand ballroom. Major brands immediately dropped her lucrative sponsorships, and her hundreds of thousands of followers vanished overnight, refusing to support a woman deeply tied to a massive federal money laundering scandal. With absolutely no corporate funds to pay for her staged extravagant photo shoots and no wealthy husband to fund her endless shopping sprees, Brianna had to finally face the harsh, unforgiving reality of the real working world. She is currently working a minimum wage retail job at a local department store. She stands on her feet for 8 hours a day, holding a plastic folding board instead of a designer leather handbag. The $30,000 custom gown she wore to the gala was seized by aggressive creditors months ago. Her perfectly manicured nails are now chipped and broken as she spends her long shifts organizing heavy clothing racks for the very same wealthy elite women she used to look down upon. As for me, I completely restructured and purified Grayson Logistics. I fired every corrupt, lazy executive Richard had ever hired and built a brilliant new team based entirely on transparency, loyalty, and hard, honest work. My grandfather Harrison's beautiful legacy is finally secure and thriving exactly the way he always intended when he started with just one delivery truck. I do not harbor any lingering hatred or burning resentment toward my parents or my sister. I simply removed their toxic, draining presence from my life permanently. Being a forensic accountant taught me how to find the hidden truth in a sea of deceptive numbers. Applying that same ruthless logic to my personal life taught me how to find my own emotional truth. I realized that true lasting power does not come from screaming at people or forcing them into cruel submission. True power comes from quiet competence, setting unbreakable personal boundaries, and deeply knowing your own absolute worth. I walk slowly over to my massive mahogany desk and sit down comfortably in the heavy leather executive chair. The sprawling office is quiet, peaceful, and entirely mine. I survived the emotional coldness, the bitter betrayal, and the toxic financial manipulation. I took the shattered, broken pieces of my lonely childhood and patiently forged them into an unbreakable, shining armor. Have you ever been pushed to the absolute edge by the exact people who were supposed to love and protect you? Have you ever had to bravely walk away from your own toxic family members just to save your own life and protect your inner peace? I truly want to hear your personal stories of survival and ultimate triumph. Please share your unique experiences in the comments section below. Your specific story might be exactly what someone else desperately needs to hear today to find their own hidden strength. If my personal journey resonated with you in any way, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories of justice, resilience, and taking back your stolen power. Thank you so much for watching, and please always remember that no matter how dark and suffocating the room gets, you always hold the key to your own absolute freedom.